I guess most dads have phrases that their kids remember. My dad did. So when I grew up, my bedroom was in the basement of our house. My parents, my three sisters, my grandmother, they occupied the upstairs room, but I was in the basement. And the light in my room was on a three-way switch. You could flip it on and off at the top of the stairs, as well as turn it on and off in the room itself. And that's what my dad did every morning. He'd stand up there flipping the switch. He was an Army guy. He'd loudly sing Reveille, and he was waking me up, even on Saturdays, because on Saturday morning, I was his slave, helping him with yard work or the garden or house projects or whatever it was he wanted to have done. And often on Saturday mornings, he had this phrase that he would remind me of: hard work never killed anybody. Now, the statement wasn't original to him, but he was a very big fan of that statement. And of course, these days, our culture pushes back on that statement, citing especially workaholism and stress as major contributors to all kinds of diseases, even some deadly ones. And there is some merit to that observation. I mean, my dad passed away at the age of 66. And while that wasn't directly a result of hard work, he certainly had done a lot of it in his life, and he'd had a lot of stress in his life. So, maybe he was a workaholic. Today, if you're a workaholic, that's kind of a badge of shame. And yet, even as we move away from that, it's possible for the pendulum to swing too far the other direction, to the place where it is our non-work choices that are killing us. I downloaded the latest Nielsen survey of media consumption. And as bad as I was expecting it to be, it was worse. The average American spends more than 11 hours a day with media. Let that sink in for a minute. Assuming you don't look at a screen while you're asleep, how do you fit in 11 hours of media and get anything else done? Even more shocking to me is that the adults in my demographic and older spend 6 or more hours a day watching TV, or at least having the TV running in their homes. Younger people spend a little less time on TV, but more on other connected devices to make up for that. Now, how can this be a healthy thing? Excess media consumption is associated with everything from obesity to social disconnection to depression and to suicide. Leisure, it turns out, can be no more healthy than workaholism. And yet it's an attractive thing in our culture. A few years ago, a guy named Nicholas Eberstadt wrote a groundbreaking book called Men Without Work. And he pointed out that nearly 10 million men in America between the ages of 25 and 54, the prime work years, have backed entirely out of the labor force, backed out even from the unemployment figures, because those include only people who are looking for work, and these guys are not looking for work. But it's what they are doing with their time that I found fascinating. One article written by Eberstadt in a journal called American Enterprise had a ton to say on the subject. And first, he asserts that there is a difference between leisure and idleness. Bluntly stated, leisure refines and elevates, while idleness corrupts and degrades. Strong statement. But he goes ahead and uses the American Time Use Survey from the U.S. government, and he compares working men, working women, unemployed men, and those who have left the labor force. He says these non-workforce men gain an additional 2,150 hours of free time each year, What is striking, however, is how little of this enormous dividend of extra free time is devoted to activities that would be of help to others in the family or the community. So these men, stay-at-home men, spend no more time on household duties or child care than employed men. They spend less time in religious and volunteer activities than any of the three other groups. They spend more time on personal care and socializing, relaxing, leisure. These have become a full-time job for the unworking American male. They commit more time to attending gambling establishments. They commit more time to tobacco and drug use than either working men and women or unemployed men, and their media consumption more than fills up the hours each day freed by their lack of employment. So Eberstadt says, to a distressing degree, these men appear to have relinquished what we ordinarily think of as adult responsibilities, not only as breadwinners, but as parents, family members, community members, and citizens. Having freed themselves of such obligations, they fill their days instead with the full-bore pursuit of more immediate sources of gratification. So that's two snapshots of idleness: the rapidly increasing consumption of media across the entire population and the checking out of the workforce of 10 million men of employable age. So how are we supposed to feel about that? The Apostle Paul actually has an answer. He devotes a long paragraph in 2 Thessalonians to what he calls idleness. And he teaches that we can stand out in this culture if we will not let the culture drain from us the value of hard work. So he sets it all up in 2 Thessalonians 3:6. Now we command you, brothers, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you keep away from any brother who is walking in idleness and not in accord with the tradition that you received from us. So this verse is a blunt command. He's telling the Thessalonians to stay away from those who have chosen a life of idleness. And he gives this command with authority in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. So we know he takes this seriously. He uses this word idle, which is actually a broad word. Paul is going to apply it narrowly to the issue of work, but its broader meaning is to be disorderly, unruly, out of line. Like the men who have withdrawn from the workforce in our day, these brothers were not only not working, but they were devoting themselves to negative pursuits. And Paul says that is not in accord with the tradition you received from us. So remember, this is the second letter to the people of Thessalonica. In the first letter, Paul told his readers that they should aspire to live quietly and to mind your own affairs and to work with your hands as we instructed you, so that you may walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one. He taught them to admonish the idle, to encourage the faint-hearted, to help the weak, and to be patient with them all. But apparently this patient admonishment hadn't paid off. We're not sure why there was a problem with idleness in Thessalonica. It may be, given the context of the two letters, that some of these brothers had become convinced that the Lord was coming back so soon that there was no need for them to do any further work. On the other hand, it could be that some of them were simply taking advantage of the new Christian ethic that had been taught them, and they were depending on the few rich Christians in Thessalonica to support the rest of them. Whatever the reason, this problem had continued, and so now Paul says, stop. Just don't have anything to do with these people. Don't support them. Don't give them benevolence. Maybe even stop fellowshipping with them entirely. I mean, this is a very strong command. But what does idleness look like today? Trevin Wax has an essay called Consume, Create, or Cultivate Your Choice. I ran across this essay in May. The ideas have resonated with me all summer. So Wax says, every day we have the choice to consume something, to create something, or to cultivate something. The pressures of our current cultural moment, he says, push us to consume. But the need of the day is for people to create or cultivate. The problem with idleness, Wax says, in Thessalonica or today, is consumption. He defines consuming as the passive reception of entertainment through television shows, movies, video games, and so on. Through that passive consumption, we develop the idea that this entertainment is what we work for. It's the reward of our work. It's what we live for. But he says, surely we were made for something more than powering through our work week so we could spend hours binge watching TV or gaming on the weekends. God has built into us, he says, a rhythm of work and rest, but it's a fallacy to believe that resting is always and only consumptive in nature. Restful activity can also be spent in cultivating and creating. Okay, that's the key thought from Trevin Wax's thing. So let me say it again. He says it's a fallacy to believe that resting is always and only consumptive in nature. Restful activity can also be spent in cultivating and creating. We're going to look at that. But first, let's look at Paul's example, verses 7 to 9. For you yourselves know how you ought to imitate us, because we were not idle when we were with you, nor did we eat anyone's bread without paying for it, but with toil and labor we worked day and night, that we might not be a burden to any of you. It was not because we do not have that right, but to give you in ourselves an example to imitate. Paul's not shy about using himself as an example. And he tells these people specifically here, imitate me. I mean, he says us, possibly referring to himself and his companions, but he's really talking about the example that he himself set. I was not idle when I was with you. I was not disruptive. I was not unruly. I was not out of line in this whole area of working hard. He says we did not accept charity. We did not eat anyone's bread without paying for it. Now, I'm not saying that it's never right to accept support from others. We know from Philippians and other places that Paul did that at times and that he was extremely grateful for it when support came in. And, who am I to talk? I have accepted support from all of you for the last 25 years. Almost every dime that I've spent has come from the generosity of people in this room. But Paul is saying this, I never took advantage of that kind of thing as an excuse for idleness or specifically as an excuse for laziness. He says, with toil and labor we worked night and day that we might not be a burden to any of you. So Paul is saying, look at my example, I worked hard. I mean, the words toil and labor speak for themselves. The words night and day speak for themselves. Now, was all this labor in tent making? I mean, we know Paul was a tent maker. We know that he supported himself that way from time to time. And so did he do that day and night? No, I don't think so. I don't think that's what Paul was up to. I think he's talking about making tents in order to support his ministry. He made tents and he poured himself into the people of Thessalonica night and day. That's the example that he wants them to follow, of this formed hard work that encompasses ministry. Now, I'm not Paul, but I'm going to go out on a limb, as I don't think I do very often, and say that I have tried hard, I've worked hard to live up to the trust that you place in me and to your generosity. I may not always work good, but I do work hard. And so from time to time over the years, I've metered my work week. And I've never come up with anything less than 90 hours. And I don't say that to boast, but as Paul says, to give what I hope is an instructive example, possibly even one that can be imitated. But the place of the imitation that I'm driving at is the same place where this idea of cultivating and creating instead of consuming comes into the picture. So many of my hours, and probably some of yours, are spent cultivating and creating. In my job, because of the way it works out, I tend to call all that stuff work, which is how the number of hours gets so high. Now, you may think of your paid job, only that, as work, and your unpaid hours as something else. But my point is that in those hours, all of us have the opportunity to turn from consuming to creating or cultivating. We can all work in those two middle categories, and I believe we're called to do so. So the most fun category in there is that word cultivating. Wax says, as cultivators, we engage in something that makes a demand of us. It can be the development of the mind through reading and study, or cultivating a skill, or a hobby, or restoring a car, or playing a musical instrument, or working in the garden. It's an activity that requires mental and physical exertion as we make something of the world that we've been given. And in turn, he says that activity makes something, it develops something in us. And I would add to that, I don't know why he didn't mention it, but there was a tremendous work of cultivating relationships, focusing on people, investing in people as a non-consuming way to invest our time and energy. So part of the reason I like the word cultivation is that Adam was a gardener. He was put in the Garden of Eden to work it, to cultivate it, to take care of the garden. So what do you think of when you hear the word gardener? Maybe you think of a home gardener, someone with a green thumb and a lovely front yard, or a bountiful vegetable garden. I mean, there's no paycheck for that kind of cultivation, but there is a reward. There's satisfaction and even some sustenance from that labor. Or maybe you think of a professional gardener, someone out of an English movie hired by the lord of the estate to tend his gardens and to make them beautiful. Tending those formal gardens would be both his profession and his livelihood. And yet he didn't own those things. He was a steward for the lord of the estate. And we would say of both these kinds of gardeners that they cultivated a garden. Okay, so what kind of gardener was Adam? Well, he was both kinds. On the one hand, the garden he tended wasn't his own. It belonged to the Lord of the creation, and both the Lord and Adam knew that he gardened as a steward under the Lord's authority. And yet there was a tremendous reward, both in sustenance and in satisfaction, for the effective execution of his duty. And so it's those two aspects of cultivation, stewardship and sustenance, that were the first biblical model of work. Adam worked. But at the fall, Adam was cursed. And he was cursed really to be a farmer and not a gardener. I mean, since then, ask any farmer, his work has been characterized by drudgery, by dissatisfaction, by failure, and not so much by the joys of cultivation. Andrew Peterson reflects this cultivation thing in his great song, Planting Trees, which oddly enough I've never done a video for, but the first verse is about the actual planting and watering of maple trees. The second verse is about a man who goes to Africa to adopt a child, and that's planting a tree. And the third verse is about a mother's role. Peterson says, she rises up as morning breaks. She moves among these rooms alone before we wake, And her heart is so full it overflows. She waters us with love, and the children grow. So he says, many years from now, long after we are gone, these trees, these children, will spread their branches out and bless the dawn. Mothers and fathers, too, are cultivators, stewards of God's work in the lives of children. And in the same way, Paul is saying that his toil and labor day and night is not so much focused on the tents that he made, although that was provision, but his cultivation was people. His cultivation was believers. That's what he was investing himself in. And so my 90 hours, which is all smeared together, is not very often, some of it, but not very often, drudgery, right, or mere work to put a paycheck in my bank. It's cultivation. And I hope I'm right in saying that it's cultivation of people by spending time in relationships. It's also, however, cultivation of spiritual maturity by spending time in prayer and in the Word. And it's cultivation of skills in writing sermons, writing other things, making videos and stuff like that. So Paul is saying, imitate me, work day and night, toil and labor, but don't be so narrow in your vision that you see work as only the drudgery of providing. Don't narrow your vision so much that the rest of your life can only find things that are consuming. Instead, recognize and embrace that so much of life can be a delight when you make it cultivation and creating. It has value, verses 10 to 13. For even when we were with you, we would give you this command, if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. For what we hear is that some among you walk in idleness, not busy at work, but busy bodies. Now such persons we command and encourage in the Lord Jesus Christ to do their work quietly and to earn their own living. As for you, brothers, do not grow weary in doing good. So Paul goes back to his time with the Thessalonians. He repeats a significant, memorable form of what he had taught them. He says, we gave you this command. If anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. Now, that's blunt. It's kind of catchy, too. If you don't work, you don't eat. But it's also something he intends to be taken seriously. He's talking about what may be the drudgery part of work. The work you do simply to provide for yourself and probably for others. And he's saying to the idle, those who are only consuming, maybe to those who have left the workforce without a good reason, he's saying, get a job. Find some way to put bread on the table. Don't sink into the morass of media. Don't spend your nights playing video games and your days sleeping. Don't live the rest of your life on the government dole. And don't just talk about it. Do the full-time job of getting a job and do the hard work of providing for yourself and your family. Notice, though, that he does qualify the statement subtly but in an important way. What he doesn't say is if a man cannot work, he should not eat. That would go against what God has taught us about mercy and caring for each other. Now, he says, if a man is not willing to work, he should not eat. And circumstances are real. There are times, places, seasons, physical reasons why a certain individual just can't get or can't do work of even the simplest kind. Paul isn't talking about the person who is willing but genuinely unable. He's talking about the person who is somewhat able but unwilling. These men not in the workforce today include a huge number who are on disability and other government programs. Now, I'm not saying all of these are fake. I'm not saying all these are inappropriate, but many people are taking advantage of a program to avoid work that might be made more difficult by their circumstances or physical illnesses. Paul elaborates on those people in verse 11. For we hear that some among you walk in idleness. They are disorderly, they're out of line because, he says, they're not busy at work, they're busybodies. The translation does a good job of capturing Paul's play on two Greek words with the same root. These are people who could work on some level, but they choose idleness. Furthermore, they choose idleness not to help the community or the family, but to disrupt the community and the family. Today, I'm afraid these are the people with the greater than 11-hour daily media addiction. They are the ones, we all know them, who are posting inflammatory political comments on Facebook and social media, cultivating a culture of incivility. Or maybe these are just the rabid fanboys who spend their whole time shouting, Star Wars, Star Trek, Star Wars, Star Trek, the whole time. Verse 12. Now such persons we command and encourage in the Lord Jesus Christ to do their work quietly and to earn their own living. This is how we as believers can stand out from our culture. We can turn from rabid consumption to cultivation to creation to provision. The blessing of hard work is not so much that it blesses us, though it does, but that it blesses other people. We provide by it for our loved ones. We care for other people through that work. One of my favorite verses on this whole subject, and I wish I could spend more time on this, but listen to Ephesians 4:28. Paul says, let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor doing honest work with his own hands. Why? So that he may have something to share with anyone in need. I mean, that's not just work. That's work as cultivation. That's work for the sake of relationships. That's work for the sake of caring for others. That ennobles what you do from 9 to 5 or 8 to 6 or 7 to midnight every day. Verse 13. And as for you, brothers, those of you who are doing this, do not grow weary in doing good. I mean, we're tempted. We're tempted to grow weary, to justify a retreat into consumption. I've worked hard all day. I don't have any energy left for my wife or for my kids or for a small group or for any of these things, for any of these relationships. We get weary and we retreat into consumption, turning on the TV, watching Netflix, flicking through Facebook, whatever it is. If we would turn from that, we would find tremendous blessing in doing good, tremendous blessing in cultivation, tremendous blessing in creating. So I want to close with two quick things. The first is to talk a bit about creativity. And the point is this. We are each made in the image of God. And in making us, in creating us, one of the things that he has done for every single person in this room is to put a creative impulse and ability into your life. And it may be very different between one person and the next, but you are made in the image of God. You are made to be creative. Trevin Wax says that creating is the invention of something that did not exist before. As creators, we leave something behind for others to enjoy and benefit from. We might compose a piece of music, write a poem or a story or an article, or paint a portrait. He goes on after that to expand the definition beyond what we would normally call the arts. And he includes things like cooking, engineering, furniture making, mothering, fathering, grandparenting. These are creative activities. Now, it's clear that the line between cultivation and creation is kind of fuzzy. But when you try to cultivate something, from a child to a cantata, when you try to do that cultivation in a new, and usually you're trying for some kind of beauty, a new and beautiful way, then you have crossed the line into creation. I like to think that the hours I spend creating a sermon are both the work I have to do and the focus of as much creative thought as I can muster. Trying to answer the question creatively each week, how can I communicate what God has said to you people? So this spring, Gail spent a ton of hours, Gail, Bobby, others, growing this garden, and then Gail began to explore the wonders of pickling. All right? So gardening is cultivation. Pickling for her, for those hours, turned out to be creation. How are we going to make this work? How are we going to make this taste good? That's creation. It's a step up from cultivation. So the range of possibilities for you in those hours, and they may feel like not many, but those hours when you're not asleep and you're not just doing maintenance, the range of possibilities are very broad. Right? And I would encourage you to take a look at this thing and see where you might fit in some cultivation, because it's good for your soul, and some creation. So there are 4 things on the line. Providing, by which I mean the repetitive part of your job, whether that's in a chemical plant or in an office or in a dirty kitchen. At the other end of the line is consumption. And you can't go straight across from the drudgery of providing to the relief of consumption, thinking that this is what God intends as your reward for your work, but you never touch creation or cultivation. That's not going to work for you. There's no blessing in that, but you can also see providing, cultivation, creation, you can see them as 3 positive parts, somewhat mixed up, of your toil and labor day and night. And these focus, maybe in different ways, the whole of your life on these things that bring blessing to you and others, while minimizing consumption, thereby cultivating family, cultivating church, cultivating relationships, cultivating skills, cultivating spiritual maturity, thereby creating beauty and blessing for other people. This is the way we stand out against our culture. This is the positive contrast to our culture. This is not drudgery. Well, there's drudgery components and everything, but this is not drudgery. This is the positive alternative to the idleness that Paul commands each of us to avoid.